The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.
This webinar is made possible thanks to generous donor support. Now, before we get started, I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Matthew Lerner is an associate professor of psychology, psychiatry, and pediatrics in the Department of Psychology at Stony Brook University, where he directs the Social Competence and Treatment Lab. He is the founding director and current research director of the Spotlight program at the Northeast ARC in Massachusetts, a year-round program for social competence and confidence development, serving more than 200 youth annually. He has presented at more than 100 national and international conferences on topics related to social development and developmental disorders. Dr. Lerner's research focuses on understanding emergence and the real-world implications of social problems in children and adolescents, especially those with autism, as well as developmental evaluation and dissemination of novel evidence-based approaches for ameliorating those problems. He's published roughly 80 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and serves on numerous editorial boards. Now I will turn it over to Dr. Lerner.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So it's really a pleasure to get a chance to share some of this work with you all. Excited to present to you a bit on some of the things that we've learned here at Stony Brook over the last several years. Some of the directions that we're heading in, and importantly, to take some time to answer some of your questions and have some good discussion at the end. So, as Steve mentioned, our focus here is our sort of understanding this idea of what do we mean when we're talking about social competence, social functioning. It's complicated, and it's in some ways, feels subjective, right? So our hope is to say that subjective does not mean unquantifiable, because if something is quantifiable, we can then help folks who are having challenges understand the nature of those challenges and use that to drive the ways in which we can support individuals who struggle socially. So today I'm going to be presenting to you, first of all, just a brief little background on this idea of sort of social competence and what it is and how we consider this topic. I then want to talk a little bit about this idea of how do we understand social skills problems. And I put skills in quotes because over time, after many years of working in this field, I am less and less convinced that social can be boiled down easily to skills. And this is because, if you think about what a skill is, right? The ability to, if I want to, teach a child how to play baseball, and I want to teach them baseball skills. I put a ball in front of them, and I teach them how to get their muscles going in the right direction and point the bat correctly and swing that bat. And the idea is that that's sort of a specific kind of routine and ability that you can then use and replicate, sort of muscle memory that you can then use and replicate and get better and better at in a sort of a skilled way. And the challenge with social stuff is that some aspects involve some kinds of skills, but in many ways it boils down to something much more dynamic. And so rather than thinking about social skills, I think about kind of how folks present in a social context and how that relates to the underlying mechanisms that drive social interaction, that give you the capacity to engage effectively in that back and forth. What's going on underneath? And so my hope, one thing I hope is that over the next 45 minutes, you might get sick of hearing me say the word mechanism. If you do, I've done my job, because my hope is that you will come away with a better understanding of some of the mechanisms that we assume or imply are at play in helping people to be effective socially. And importantly, better understand some of the evidence around those mechanisms. That is to say, are they actually doing what we think they're doing? My hope is to then kind of tie that together for you to think about this idea of, what does this all mean practically? How do we use that? And then we're going to just hint a little bit briefly at the idea of what this could mean for intervention. And I'd be happy to give future presentations where we describe in more detail what that means, and we can discuss some questions. So again, we're doing this via a focus on individuals on the spectrum, particularly adolescents on the spectrum. And really, we have this focus, here in my lab for a number of reasons. The first reason is because when you're trying to understand social functioning, in some ways, autism individuals on the spectrum are kind of an ideal group to work with. And this is because social challenges are part of the definition, the DSM definition of autism, right? So if you're trying to figure out the kind of signal in the noise of the social context, saying, what's going on for an individual person, folks on the spectrum kind of give us a really valuable and important signal so that we can, again, pinpoint what's going on for them so that we can better design ways to help. But the second reason is that, importantly, that signal is meaningful beyond just the autism spectrum. There's this notion that nowadays it's gotten more and more popular over time that everyone is quote unquote a little bit on the spectrum, and there's some complexity to that idea. This is from a New York Magazine article called "Are You on It?" I think whether we can sort of debate whether or not we believe in the idea that everyone is sort of a little bit on the spectrum, but I think what we can say is that there are features of ASD that appear across almost all populations. So what this thing is up here, this little rainbow bird spaceship thing, is a figure created by a graduate student named Hyun-Sik Kim. We published this past year, in which we looked at thousands, actually 6,000 kids around the country with and without ASD who were referred to psychiatric clinics. Kids who were coming for outpatient help of any kind. It could be kids with autism, it could be kids with anxiety, it could be kids with depression, kids with ADHD. And we tried to map out, we tried to answer the fundamental question, what is autism? What is the shape of autism? Is it a categorical diagnosis where there's just everybody on the spectrum kind of clusters over here, and everyone who isn't on the spectrum, they have almost no autism symptoms? Is it sort of continuous, right? Is it really that everyone's a little bit on it, or something in between? And what we find is this rainbow phoenix kind of thing, perhaps a new mascot, which essentially means, it shows us that autism can be best understood not just as a spectrum, but actually as three spectra, as three related dimensions that do actually cut across being on or off, having a diagnosis or not. So this is sort of the space that this thing floats in. You can have sort of more symptoms over here and less over here. And importantly, whether or not somebody has a diagnosis, if we sort of overlaid that, it almost looks speckled across this image, meaning it's not like everybody with autism just clusters up in this little red corner with more symptoms. So what this means, this is a sort of complex and I think in some ways somewhat beautiful way of showing that understanding how the features of ASD present, particularly the social features, must have an implication for people who are not on the spectrum too, but struggle socially. And so if we can capture a better understanding of what's going on and how those challenges come about, we can not only help those on the spectrum who have social challenges, but really anybody who's experiencing those kinds of difficulties. And the third reason is that, importantly, there are certain features of social development that emerge increasingly, we realize, reliably in folks on the spectrum that can actually directly inform how we might proceed with treatment, and that we can actually use what we learned about the processes that sort of underlie social development in ASD to create developmentally tailored cognitive and behavioral interventions. So one of my favorite stories to tell from giving these talks is about a young man I met many years ago. It was coming in for one of our treatment programs, and I said, well, what do you think we're doing here? And he said to me, well, I think everyone in my class is psychic but me. I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, told me about, there were kids in the back of his classroom who, whenever the teacher would make a dumb joke, one child would roll his eyes, the other child would go, and he thought that one child was having a seizure and the other child was burping, and he was very confused by the whole thing until he realized there's something they were communicating that he was missing. And he wanted to know what that thing was. So he said he was coming to me for some psychic powers. So we worked together for a few weeks, and I asked him after a little bit, how we do it on those psychic powers, and he said, well, I think I have some now, but I'd like some more, please. And this is, of course, very rewarding and made me very happy as a clinician. But then I talked to his mom, and what his mom said is that this whole psychic powers idea really only occurred to him about 6 months earlier. And that prior to that, he was kind of blissfully unaware of the differences between himself and other people, that he had developed this sort of insight kind of in early adolescence that that really not only impacted the way he engaged with the social world, but it also impacted the way we proceeded in treatment. Because a lot of what we did with this young man was using kind of social detective type approaches, right? Where I would give him homework to go back and watch two kids who we thought were doing something particularly well, and kind of write it down and think about it and figure out how he would do it differently or similarly. And of course, I realized that his ability to do that, his willingness to even do that, was in some ways contingent on this psychic powers realization, right? 6 months earlier, if he came in, he probably wouldn't have cared that much if I said, well, go home and try this out, rather than showing up every week excited and motivated, or really working to sort of want to make change. And this is just one example, one small example of a sort of step in social development, social cognitive development, that not only changes how we think about how this one particular young man, but really this is applicable to many folks on the spectrum, present, but it also is applicable, it can directly inform how we proceeded in trying to help him. And that's the example of what I'm talking about. So who are we talking about when we're talking about folks with social challenges then? We're talking in many ways about sort of alphabet soup of diagnoses, ASD, ADHD, OCD, pick your letters. But really we're talking about anyone who can be overwhelmed by social information, have difficulty processing social cues, have trouble making friends and maintaining relationships, and have trouble understanding others' perspectives. And indeed, I feel like all of this kind of adds up to what the great Peter Hobson said many years ago, and then reiterated in 2013, that these challenges emerge from the social difficulties of ASD stem from difficulties in components of action and reaction necessary for the development of reciprocal, affectively charged interpersonal relationships with others. And I think it's really important that we keep that in mind, that the goal here is these reciprocal, affectively charged relationships. So what I mean by that is those deep, meaningful relationships, those people that you can be instantly at ease with, the folks you can call up at the drop of a hat no matter what, and they'll pick up the phone, and they'll be there for you, whether things are great or hard. And these are the folks that help us get through the tough times and the great times in life. And it turns out having those kinds of deep relationships, huge volume of literature across many fields of psychology and epidemiology and sociology and economics even shows us, are really essential for many aspects of being human. Having that sense of a connection with someone. And that's ultimately what we're aiming for here when we're trying to support social competence and social functioning. And that's really what this is all about. And so I want to keep that in mind, because of course it's easy to confuse that with social behavior, and social behavior can be part of it. But ultimately our goal here is not just to help kids develop ways to look or act or seem more social, but actually to experience that sense of connection in the world. And importantly then, we then have to start to unpack this part, right? The components of action and reaction. What are the processes that are going on? In a sense, how does this happen? How does this young girl get from here to here, the kind of biggest and smallest distance in the world? Well, another way to think about that is, well, what's the mechanism, or what's the process underlying her social functioning that kind of can support or get in the way? And in fact, thinking about things mechanistically and using that to drive how we think about intervention is not a new idea at all. In fact, many other fields are founded on this notion. For instance, in medicine, right, when you're talking about taking aspirin, people don't think aspirin is magic. We understand various ways and pathways that underlie how it works. Aspirin, for instance, inactivates something called the COX enzyme, which is required for prostaglandins, and suppress what's called production of prostaglandins, which are sometimes implicated in the production of a headache. And this is in fact part of one mechanism of how aspirin reduces pain. And of course there are others, but the point being, this is sort of a metaphor, right? If we can understand what the sort of equivalent processes are for social functioning, we may be able to do a better job of helping those who struggle. So there are a number of social skills mechanisms that have been posited in the literature for decades. And one of the things that we try to do in our lab is test those mechanisms that people have long assumed to be important, but we haven't actually checked whether they are, or haven't done so in as thorough a way as we would like. I'm going to talk to you through a few of them that we're going to discuss today, right now. So the first one is this idea of social knowledge, or the ability to know what to do socially, to know the rules. And in fact, this is sort of the layperson's theory often of social challenges in ASD. If you had a teenager on the spectrum who was in your family or was your student, and they were struggling to make friends, and you kind of picked a random person off the street and said, "Hey, you, why do you think Johnny here is having trouble making friends?" They might think, "I don't know, he doesn't know what to do." And in fact, this theory underlies most of our interventions for social challenges too. It's about teaching rules. It's about assuming that kids don't know what to do. But importantly, up until very recently, not a lot of work had gone on trying to check whether or not social knowledge is actually implicated in ASD. That is to say, whether or not folks on the spectrum have challenges, specific challenges in social knowledge. If they did, first of all, we just need to understand that social knowledge is something that's measurable, right? All the things we're going to talk about today are measurable. So how would you measure social knowledge? You might, for instance, give somebody a questionnaire where they can just explicitly answer questions about what do you do when you first meet somebody? Should you A, stand there and say nothing, B, punch them in the face, C, put your hand up to shake theirs, or D, run away screaming? Of course, the answer we're looking for is not B, but C. And so we would maybe hand this out to a number of kids with ASD and without ASD, and see how they do. And we would expect that if social knowledge was truly a mechanism of social challenges in ASD, two things would be true. One, the average score, the average number of correct answers on that questionnaire would be less in kids on the spectrum. And two, those who answered that question more and more correctly would also be folks who we would see being more successful socially in interactions with peers. But once again, we didn't really know this until recently, although this is something that we're going to check. I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes. It's, what have we learned about social knowledge? The next is this idea of social cognition, right? So, how do folks think about their social situations? How do kids on the spectrum, for instance, are they able to read emotions or understand perspectives or plan how they're going to respond socially or regulate their responses in social situations and think about doing that? Importantly, we do have a long history of sort of testing these things. There's been the theory of mind theory of autism. There's been the emotion recognition theories of autism for years. But what we haven't done is carefully take into account the fact that all of those things are going on within a single person. So what we've done is we've sort of ended up getting stuck on whatever thing we were measuring and assuming that that must apply more broadly. And so one of the things that we can do now is begin to look for an individual person and say, all right, well, for this individual, are any of these things a challenge? Are they having trouble reading emotions? Are they having trouble taking perspective? And if so, which one matters? Or maybe none of them matter for having successful interactions with peers. So maybe you know what to do. Maybe you have good ability to take other people's perspective, or your ability to do that is sort of good enough to get you through the day. But maybe the mechanism is in this idea of insight or self-awareness, or sort of knowing, being able to reflect on your own social ability. Well, it turns out that insight is another mechanism that we have a long history of making assumptions about. In fact, as a clinical psychologist, I'm trained to think a lot about insight and often assume that insight is important, right? This is what we do often professionally. In fact, that's what I did just a few minutes ago when I told you about my young friend who wanted the psychic powers, right? What he had developed was something like insight into his social differences. And I assumed that that mattered for him, and I assumed that that mattered for treatment. But importantly, again, this is an empirical question that we can and we must test with good data collection to understand whether or not that was really what was going on for him. The next is this idea of maybe you have insight into your ability, but maybe you're just not as motivated to interact. And in fact, this is sort of a very hot theory in the sort of autism research world nowadays. But it's another example of where we need to be careful as researchers to also listen to individuals and families, because when I give these talks to five family groups or to individuals on the spectrum, and I say, well, how many of you know somebody on the spectrum who would like more friends or who is motivated to interact? Most hands usually go up in those rooms. That's certainly been my experience working with thousands of individuals over the years. And so that sort of calls into question the notion that social motivation is definitely always a challenge for everyone. But if not, or if it's more complicated than that, then what's happening? Well, again, that's something we need to understand and take data on, and we can measure that. The next is sort of an idea that comes from the experiences of adults on the spectrum. Often when we talk to individuals, they tell us, I know what to do. I can usually work out what somebody else's perspective is. I have good insight into my own social behavior. I'm motivated to interact. But when I'm trying to respond in the moment, it sort of takes me this one extra click, this extra amount of processing time or effort to get there. And that by the time I get there, by the time I figure out, all right, this is what I intend to say, or this is the response I'm ready to give, they've moved on to the next thing. And that sort of efficiency of social processing social information is potentially crucial, and that's certainly something we're hearing clinically. But the question is, how much does that specifically matter in predicting real-world social functioning? So maybe you know what to do, you can understand others' perspectives, you have good insight, you're motivated to interact, you can keep up. Well, the next construct is this idea of social creativity, which is maybe you have difficulty sort of responding to unexpected or novel social situations. And maybe you can get it if you understand the parameters of the situation. It's really clear what's going to happen next, and people are kind of behaving in a predictable way, sort of the way that many young kids on the spectrum interact better with adults, in part because we are a little more predictable, right? Maybe you can handle that, but then when novel situations come your way, you can't quite keep up with that, or you don't know what to do. You're ready when somebody puts their hand out to shake theirs, but if a peer comes up and goes, "Hey man, what's up?" and slaps your hand, you're befuddled. So this is again something we sort of hear clinically and sort of seen described in the literature, but very little work has actually gone ahead and tried to test whether this idea of social creativity or coming up with novel solutions to social problems is something that matters a lot for whether or not somebody is socially successful. And once again, as I'll show you soon, this is something that we can both measure and understand and relate to those outcomes. So maybe you can do all of these things, but you just have fewer interactions. Maybe in the course of your day, you're just interacting with fewer people, and that you'd be much more, you'd be plenty socially successful if you just had more opportunities to interact. This is another theory that pervades actually a lot of our intervention approaches. Often we say we want to create new social opportunities, and we want kids to try out new social situations, or even adults on the spectrum to try new social situations. But again, I would argue that that's an empirical claim about a mechanism. We're assuming that those interactions are less, that they're somehow meaningfully different, and that those differences are important for whether or not that person is able to go ahead and have friends or develop relationships they want. And this is again something we can and must test. And finally, maybe you can do all these things, you have plenty of interaction, but you just have difficulty calibrating your behavior to different social contexts. actually in the moment behaving differently when you're in the classroom versus in the lunchroom versus at home. It turns out that this ability to change your behavior to your context is in some ways at the heart of social competence, right? Social competence, given that it's not just a skill, but really an ability to calibrate to whatever the demands of the situation are. At the end of the day, whether you can do it or not might be something that matters for whether or not ultimately you can develop those meaningful reciprocal relationships. But once again, that's something that's been little studied. And of course, there are many others, but these are the ones we'll talk about today. So let's dive in. So beginning then with this idea of social knowledge, right? What we've done now in a number of studies, 3 different sets of samples now of teens on the spectrum compared to typically developing teens, often kind of a similar age. We do is we test them. We ask them these questions about, do you know what to do in social situations? And then we see whether or not they perform differently, whether or not they have ASD, and whether or not those who have more knowledge, when interacting with peers, for instance, are actually engaging in more pro-social behavior. Are they making more friends? Are they saying hi more rather than punching people in the face? Are they doing the things they say they know? And what we found reliably now across almost every sample we've looked at is not really. That is to say, knowing what to do does not appear to be related to doing it. What we find is that on average, kids on the spectrum actually don't seem to have any less social knowledge than their peers. They're about the same on our measures. However, what we do find is a wider range among kids on the spectrum. So we have some kids who know every single answer. In fact, I think in many of our studies, it's only the kids on the spectrum where there's a group that literally doesn't get any of these questions wrong. Whereas there are other kids on the spectrum who are truly guessing. So the range is wider, but importantly, where you sit on that range doesn't appear to relate to whether or not you then go ahead and use those skills, right? So it's not like the child who knows every single answer is also a child who then, when he meets an unfamiliar peer, is able to strike up a conversation, or when there is in the classroom is able to initiate and maintain friendships effectively. So this was an important discovery for us because it goes to show that this thing that we often target, this idea of knowing what to do, at least on its own, is not the essential ingredient, is not alone the essential mechanism for social success. So what about this idea of social cognition, measuring across domains? So I'm fortunate to work with Dr. Nicole Russo-Ponsaran at Rush University. We recently conducted a multi-site study using a tool that they've developed over there at Rush called CellWeb, which is really the first digital tool that lets us measure multiple different aspects of social cognition in the same child. So we can measure their ability to read emotions and faces. We can measure their ability to understand the perspectives of others. We can understand their ability, we can measure their ability to plan how they respond in certain kinds of social situations. We can measure their ability to regulate their behavior when interacting with peers. And what we found, first of all, is that this measure works well. It works comparably to how we would measure it in other ways, and it does relate to does seem to relate to some aspects of social functioning, including things like severity on the ADOS, which is sort of our gold standard diagnostic measure. But that importantly, there's a lot of variability within and between kids. So what this is these little blobs are telling you about the sample that we looked at across each of these domains. So this is sort of everyone's performance across all of the sort of this is across all of the perspective taking abilities. This is the variation in terms of facial emotion recognition, self-control, social planning, theory of mind, and perspective taking. Importantly, 100 right here, this is standardized just like an IQ test. So 100 on this measure is what typically developing kids do. And you see that actually our sample, kids didn't do much more poorly actually than their peers in that way. But that there was a lot of variability, and there were some kids who did considerably more poorly, and some who were actually significantly better than typically developing kids. And this is true across domains. And importantly, what we found is that the profiles of these kids often looked like this. So we found, for instance, that you might have somebody who's really good at reading emotions and social planning, but is less good at self-control, and that they're sort of mean social emotional skills. Sorry, these two graphs are swapped. So imagine this is sort of their overall ability. These two, if you imagine the orange and the green kind of swapped, their average ability is like a little bit below average. But importantly, you know, there's some pretty wide variability across those domains for that child. That they almost have these individualized profiles that matter for how they're ultimately doing overall. Right? So here's a child, for instance, who's great at self-control, sort of the opposite, but really struggles with social planning, perspective taking, and emotion recognition. So he might look overall, if you just sort of tested him on any one of these things, if you just tested these two guys on, for instance, their emotion recognition ability, they would look wildly different. You have one child where you say, he's doing great, and another where you say, wow, he's really struggling here. But importantly, it's really the integration of these things together that seems to matter most. And then here's somebody, right, who, for instance, did just kind of okay, a little bit below average across domains. And we often, when we're measuring any one of these things in neuropsychological testing and clinics and research, we're often assuming that anyone we're measuring kind of looks like this, right? That, oh, well, I captured their emotion recognition ability, but actually I'm making inferences across domains. And what we've learned from this is that it's not that simple, and that understanding how somebody's processing their social world, how they're thinking about their social world, is deeply informed and enhanced by taking account of multiple different domains within the child, and that can ultimately help us do a better job of understanding what each person's needs are. So what have we learned so far? We've learned that perhaps social knowledge might be not as important as we thought, and that for social cognition, individual profiles matter. So what next? What about this idea of insight or self-awareness? So this is something we've also measured in a number of different studies, really looking just at how kids report on their own social behavior relative to how others report on them. So we ask a child to rate their own social skills and compare that to the way their parent rates them, their teacher, etc. And what we find actually is this phenomenon quite often. We find essentially kids who are we find sort of kittens who in the mirror are lions. So what we mean is kids will often, on the spectrum, will often rate their own social skills considerably higher than their peers or their parents rate them. And this is a phenomenon actually that's not new. It's new, a little bit new to the autism world, but it's not new more broadly because it's something we see a lot in the field of ADHD. In the study of ADHD, there's a phenomenon called the positive illusory bias. And this is essentially that kids with ADHD seem to do this, rate themselves higher than other people rate them, except not just in social domains, in most domains, in academics and athletics, and whether their room is clean. You know, if you ask them and then ask their peers or ask their parents, others around them, even objective observers, they'll often rate themselves higher. And there's this theory that the place that this comes from is that perhaps many of these kids, you know, are aware that they struggle in these domains, but they're missing. They don't necessarily know how to get out of it, and they are, you know, trying to bolster their self-esteem. And so one way that they do this is by saying, "Oh, actually, I'm pretty good at that." And this is important to know because what this means is that they're perhaps using that in a way that's more fragile, right? So it's a fragile foundation to build your self-esteem on if it doesn't accord with what other people are seeing and saying, or perhaps what you even know. And then we find our findings are actually kind of fit with that. We find that kids who have this bigger gap between themselves and others report less depression. They report less hostile view of others. So, you know, if you ask them, if you describe a situation to them, neutral situation, they will say that the other kids in that situation are not being mean, they're being understanding. But we also find that there's some negative consequences too, that there's that their parents, for instance, report less self-efficacy or less of an ability to help them. Because if the parent's sitting downstairs saying, you know, Johnny, you got to go to your social skills class, and Johnny's upstairs playing video games and says, nah, I'm good. That can create a real tension within the household. And I think this ultimately tells us is that one of the things that we need to do if we're trying to help somebody who's struggling socially, we cannot just spend time telling them ways in which they are not doing well. that if we proceed in that way, not only will that be upsetting in the moment, right? Nobody likes to have anyone sit around and just tell them all the things that they're doing poorly. It could really undermine this foundation that's being used to bolster their self-esteem and sense of self-preservation in some ways. So instead, what we often do in our interventions is we try to be really careful that any time that we are identifying or working on an area that somebody struggles with socially, we're also at the same time trying to sort of pull in something that they are genuinely good at, that we've identified with them that's a real strength, so that they can start to, rather than having kind of a house of cards to hold up their sense of self-esteem or self-worth, they can build on something a little bit more solid that everyone can agree is a strength of theirs. And importantly, my former student James Rankin, now at University of Alabama, has found as well, is that when we're talking about social skills or insight into these things, we're actually often, kids and their parents are often talking about different things entirely. So he looked at this idea of social skills importance, or what do kids or their parents say sort of matters. And essentially the take-home message from this graph is that well, kids and their parents often agree, kids on the spectrum and their parents often agree in terms of cooperation as being an important part of social skills. Parents think that being assertive and being, controlling yourself in social situations matters a lot more than the kids do, which just suggests to us that, even when you're asking a child to sort of be aware of their own social skills, they might be telling you, yeah, my cooperation's great. But really the parent is saying, yeah, but you're still struggling to be assertive, which once again highlights the importance of making sure that we're communicating effectively about what we mean when we're talking about, being more effectively social. So what about this idea of social motivation, or wanting to interact with other people? This is also something then that we can measure, for instance, by social persistence with peers, or attempting to interact effectively with others, even when it's difficult. This is something we've measured in a number of studies, and our findings have been surprising. We find, for instance, our main finding with social motivation is that kids who have more social motivation, or on the spectrum, actually have poorer emotion recognition ability. Poorer emotion recognition ability. Not what you would expect necessarily. So we thought about this, and we thought, there's many kids I've known over the years, and some of my favorite kids I've worked with in decades, they would see me and they'd run up and they would say, my goodness, I just went to this train museum and it was spectacular and it was fantastic, and I learned about this kind of train and this kind of train and this kind of train, and I or one of my colleagues would be standing there, and and not necessarily reciprocating or responding as effectively, because maybe we don't know about trains, and they're so motivated to interact, they're so motivated to share that information that it almost overwhelms their ability to read the response of others. And again, I think this is important to keep in mind, because we often simplify our understanding of mechanisms in a way that can perhaps get in our way. For instance, if you have a child like that, probably increasing their motivation is not necessarily going to be helpful, right? They might actually be plenty motivated, and in fact doing so might get in the way of their ability to read emotions of others, whereas you might have other kids who do have challenges with reading emotions. So with social motivation. So again, I think this just highlights the complexity of understanding these mechanisms. And in fact, we see evidence of how these things can interact together. So for instance, we find that kids on the spectrum who have more social motivation, but less social knowledge, they don't necessarily know what to do. They behave exactly in the way that I'm describing. So they will attempt to make interactions, but they won't be as effective to initiate with peers, but they won't be as effective in doing so. And again, this highlights the importance of understanding how these different factors work together. So again, what have we learned? We've learned that social knowledge might not be as important as we thought, that social cognition, individual profiles must matter. That social awareness, self-awareness might actually be more important than we thought, but in complicated ways, and same thing with social motivation. So what about social information processing speed or efficiency? So this is something we measure in our lab using something called EEG or electrophysiology. Don't worry, there's no electricity going into this person's head. This is instead these little electrodes that are essentially amplifiers. They're taking the brain activity that's already coming off your head right now in your daily life and amplifying it so we can read how you respond to different situations. Importantly, this is not a picture from my lab. This is actually from Roxanne Idier's lab at the University of Waterloo. These are pictures from my group here at Stony Brook. This is our former master's student now at University of Florida, Arjun, and Jackie and Lindsay. And essentially they're modeling how this works for you. And what we can do with this is we can read in real time how a person is processing stimuli, including social stimuli when they come their way. So it's pretty remarkable that our technology can do this now. But if I flash a face in front of you, I can see what happens. So about 100 milliseconds after that face hits your retina, you'll get a little blip around here. Typically, I'll show you another one in a moment. Actually, it looks like this. You get a little blip that says, "Oh, I see something." Essentially, that's your occipital cortex firing, going, "All right, I'm seeing something," and then sort of the signal kind of travels to the right and the left, kind of posteriorly around your brain, kind of right back here. Under these electrodes, you get this little negative blip. It's under something called the fusiform gyrus typically, and it's called the N170, and it says, "Hey, that's a face." And it's essentially the first step in this social processing stream, where it then moves forward and does things like tries to understand the intentions of that face. Is it a familiar face? Is it my mom? And is she happy? And all of these things, right? But importantly, this is that very first step where your brain goes, all right, this is a piece of social information that I need to use. I need to use this face to make some decisions about what I'm going to do next. And importantly, how big and how fast this blip happens, this little, what's called N170, differs between people. And one thing we've found, particularly my graduate student Erin Kang has found, is that that blip matters a lot. That it's essentially uniquely different in kids with ASD. So she did what's called a meta-analysis, looked at the whole literature, all the studies of this, and found that it happens just a little bit slower, on the order of maybe 30 to 50 milliseconds slower, which is faster than you can blink your eye. You would think it's not that much. But then if you think about all the different times, all the different instances that you're looking at faces in your daily life, these things start to add up and can start to look a little bit like that experience of feeling just a little bit behind the 8 ball, trying to keep up with the social information in the environment. And in fact, we find that it matters, that the speed, how quickly that little blip happens, relates to better emotion recognition ability in kids. That is to say, on the spectrum, that is to say, those who have faster little N170 blips do better at reading emotions from others. And importantly, we're also beginning to learn that the way that that happens is emerging from a process that suggests that the process by which the brain decodes social information may actually be is intact in folks on the spectrum. So Juan Mayer Torres, a visiting scholar in my lab, used a fancy sort of machine learning approach, and this is a lot of fancy pictures. And essentially what I will tell you here is what we found is that in several samples in kids with and without ASD, that if you just use their brain waves, look at their EEG signal and say, hey, can I tell you what emotion this person is looking at from that signal? The answer is yes, with very high accuracy. In fact, in some cases above 90% accuracy, and that accuracy doesn't differ between people with and without ASD. That is to say, the brains of folks with and without ASD can effectively decode emotional information in their environment, and in folks with ASD, the brain can do that better, more effectively than behavior would suggest, which is all a fancy way of saying essentially that the information is in there. This is not a thing that needs to sort of be taught or sort of supported prosthetically necessarily. So our goal then, again, this suggests that mechanism is working well, and we just need to figure out ways for any individual person to make it work well for them. So what about this idea of social creativity or coming up with novel solutions to social problems? Well, this is another thing that we can measure. There's a French developmental psychologist named Christophe Mouchwood who has studied this for 10 plus years. Essentially what he's found is that kids who have this social creativity or ability to come up with sort of novel solutions to social problems, typically developing kids tend to make more friends, have more positive ratings from teachers and parents. So what is it? What is this ability? So the way you measure social creativity is you bring a child in and you ask them questions like, there's a number of kids over there you'd like to play with. How would you get them to play with you? Think of as many ideas as possible. Try to think of ideas that other kids might not have. And you kind of let them go and come up with as many answers as they want. So the interesting thing about social creativity is in some ways it's the opposite of social knowledge. It's the answer, I would go over and shake their hand, is a great knowledge answer, but it scores pretty low on our social creativity scale. However, I had one child tell me once that he would call forth aliens to mind control those children to play with them. Not necessarily a very effective solution. I've never seen him effectively do it, and he never claimed to effectively call forth aliens. But he was able to kind of come up with a kind of creative solution in the moment. So the question is that ability, just that sort of flexibility in thinking, something that relates to being socially successful? In fact, it turns out it's one of the only things we've found that relates to more effective pro-social interaction. That is to say, the child who said I would go over and shake hands, he's not necessarily going over shaking hands. But the guy who's calling forth aliens, he's not saying he's not really calling forth aliens. But what he is doing is going over and saying hi and trying. And this is, I think, especially valuable for us as we think about things like intervention, right? That if we can find ways to promote social creativity, sort of promote the novel thinking about social situations, we might be able to really support kids to be more effective and ultimately make more friends. So again, just coming back to this, we've learned that social knowledge might not be as important as we thought, that individual profiles matter for cognition, that awareness and motivation is important but complicated, and that importantly, social information processing speed and creativity are particularly promising, and that effective social information processing is encoded, just not always translated. So what about the last two pieces I talked about? So the first one is this idea of quantity of social interaction. That is to say, are folks on the spectrum just engaging in less interactions or different pattern of interaction throughout the day. So my graduate student, Alan Gerber, conducted a study recently where he essentially had folks on the spectrum with adults with and without ASD on their smartphones just log their social interactions every time they talk to somebody throughout the day. And this is sort of the pattern of social behavior that we see over the course of a day for any individual person. And on average, and that's what we see. And so we asked the question, one, does that pattern differ? So maybe folks on the spectrum are just sort of off cycle with everybody else, or maybe are they just less? Are there fewer interactions happening? And what we found actually is the answer is no, they don't seem to differ. Actually, folks on the spectrum, this is the red lines are those with ASD and the blue line is not. And you notice they're overlapping a lot and you're not seeing differences because there were no differences. Essentially, having autism did not change the pattern of interaction or reduce your amount of social behavior that folks were engaged in, suggesting that interventions that just try to say, well, go interact more, might be missing the boat or identifying, again, a mechanism that's not really getting in the way for these folks. However, we did find a relationship to something called alexithymia. So some of you may have heard this term. Alexithymia is difficulty sort of reading your own emotions, your own emotional responses in different situations, being able to identify sort of how you're feeling. And it turns out that that those who had who had more alexithymia had fewer interactions, and vice versa. That is to say, the people who were able to better read their own emotions engage in more social interaction over the course of any given day or moment. This is important because actually a very high percentage, in fact, some estimates as much as 70% of folks with ASD do experience alexithymia, have challenges in this. But this highlights, I think, for us, again, this idea of mechanism, right? So it may not be autism that's getting in the way of the amount of social interaction, the amount of social opportunities folks on the spectrum are having. It might be instead this alexithymia construct, this thing that is reasonably well related to number of social interactions we see here. So more alexithymia, less social interactions, more alexithymia, less social interaction, and that therefore, if we're trying to support people socially, perhaps what we want to do is find ways to address their ability to identify and read their emotions, rather than just say, well, you have autism, you have to go, find more social hotties. And finally, what about this idea of contextual variability? So my brilliant colleague, Dr. Ken Gato, here in our Department of Psychiatry, has done some amazing work in this domain with us, where he looked at how kids' behavior differs according to teachers and parents. And what we found is these profiles. These are profiles of individuals with ASD, subgroups essentially within the population. And what we find is essentially 4 subgroups. 2 subgroups of agreement between parents. This is reports by parents. This is reports by teachers. So this is a group where the parent and the teacher said, this child has struggles across context. Doesn't matter where he is. He's having a lot of challenges. This is a second profile where kids had kind of a moderate number of challenges, according to both parents and teachers. This is sort of an agreement profile. And then here are 2 what we're calling discrepancy profiles, where essentially kids' behavior is differing by context. Here, the parents are saying, oh, they're having some troubles, and the teacher says they're fine. And here's one where the teacher says they're having troubles, but the parent says, well, no, it's okay. They're not doing too badly. And it turned out that the actual level of severity per se, for any of these scales, didn't really matter for predicting things like, diagnosis according to the ADOS, whether or not they're getting services, medication, a lot of the sort of outcomes that we might really care about, even wanting friends. But the thing that mattered the most is whether or not their behavior varied across contexts. That is to say, were they in this discrepancy profile, which again suggests to us that this ability to adjust your behavior, even if your behavior is challenging across contexts, might matter even more than how challenging that behavior is in the first place. And so this led us, with Dr. Jenna Mendelsohn and my student Jackie Gates, to come up with a sort of a new model for how to think about friendship development in ASD, where what we can do is sort of understand how surface level, the sort of kind of superficial social interactions that ultimately are necessary for developing deeper relationships, sort of emotional sharing, that sort of affectively charged interpersonal relationship, can be supported in those with ASD, particularly by trying to address some of these very factors, particularly that sort of efficiency of processing social information, social flexibility, and social creativity. And that those things together not only add up to, again, what looks like social behavior, but something that goes deeper, that leads to that deep sharing of relationships, deep sharing of emotion, which leads to the deepest structures of reciprocity, sense of mutuality, and emotional bond, which once again, we all need in our lives. So overall, what have we learned? We've learned that social knowledge might not be as important as we thought. And that in terms of social cognition, individual profile matters. The profiles matter. That in terms of self-awareness, this might matter more than we thought, and motivation as well, but they're both complicated. The social information processing speed and creativity are particularly promising, and that in fact, a lot of that information is there and is encoded, just needs to be translated effectively. The quantity of social interaction is not necessarily reduced in those with ASD, but we should consider other mechanisms like alexithymia, and that contextual variability might matter more than kind of raw severity of symptoms. So being able to sort of shift your behavior across context might matter more than the raw severity of symptoms for any individual person. And that this can all ultimately add up to a new way to understand and support friendship. So ultimately, the reason, one question is, how does this relate to intervention? Which is something I mostly want to sort of save for next time. But what I do want to tell you is that one thing we have, one tantalizing clue I'd like to leave you with, is that it turns out that social interventions can be broken down in terms of how much they focus on that knowledge, sort of knowing what to do, or how much they focus on performance or affecting or addressing these factors that are sort of underlying the performance of known social behavior. And importantly, there are interventions out there that include one, the other, or both of these. And what we're starting to learn is that perhaps by disentangling those pieces, we can figure out what interventions are going to work best for any individual person. So for that, I will let you know more next time. And so now, just to let you know, what we're doing is we're beginning to assess more of these factors that can relate to people being effectively more social, that we're trying to now develop and better understand and study those interventions that can work best. And we're trying to work more with the ASD community and families to figure out how to learn from the lived experiences of folks on the spectrum to improve and focus the questions that we're asking as researchers. And so with that, I always like to end with this quote from a participant in one of our groups, because I think this really exemplifies what we're trying to do here with all this kind of research, and ultimately, hopefully, what you're all trying to do by giving us an hour in the middle of a weekday afternoon to sit through this talk. This is the feeling I think we're all in it for. So I want to acknowledge the funders of the research that I spoke about today, as well as our collaborators in these projects, my wonderful team here at Stony Brook, and all the participating families. And thank you all for listening, and I welcome your questions.
All right, Dr. Lerner. Well, thank you so much. I'm really grateful that you said you had information for next time. So maybe after the talk, we can talk about scheduling a follow-up where we can talk about the intervention piece, if that's something you'd like to book in the future.
Sure.
Okay, great. I did have a few people ask about handouts. If you're comfortable, we could post those with the slides after we get it up online, or we can also review it just using the video playback. So you can let me know about that. If you make the slides available, I'll just post them online later.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so we had a lot of questions, as you would guess. So I'm going to go down pretty quickly and try to get the ones that are similar together. But the big one, I think a lot of what I saw questions about interoception and then also anxiety. So related to these other concepts that you were talking about, do you have any high-level comments about how anxiety ties into the social aspects and how they pick up and adapt, and how that affects, as you said, a lot of kids pick up the right rules, but it's actually generalizing them that's really difficult. So what's the role there of anxiety?
Yeah, so I'm glad that somebody brought this up, and this is sort of another line of work we study here in this lab, and do a lot of work with some colleagues like Connor Kearns, who's really one of the leaders in the study of anxiety and ASD, and trying to understand sort of how anxiety manifests uniquely. I think in terms of how anxiety plays out in social settings, I think we have there's sort of a dynamic effect that can happen. So essentially, we know that there's often kind of a higher level of, even just start with sensory reactivity that folks on the spectrum have. That's come on, is on board from childhood, and that importantly, what can happen in social situations over time, which are difficult to anticipate, difficult maybe to decode if you're on the spectrum, that can ultimately become, if something is if you're reactive to something and it's difficult to decode and difficult to understand and difficult to make sense of, that's a great recipe for anxiety over time, especially if you're not sort of, developing skills to kind of manage that response. So by the time we see teens on the spectrum, we do see pretty high rates of anxiety as well. And we find actually that interacts with our interventions and actually with some of our social outcomes. What I can say is clinically, when we're trying to address many of these social challenges, I often think of anxiety as sort of the eggshell that we need to crack first before somebody can begin to try to initiate more peers. All right, or to try to come up with novel solutions, and that the way we do that really is a variation on the most effective interventions for anxiety in general, which are things like exposures. And I don't mean pushing people into situations that make them anxious and just saying figure it out. What I mean is giving individuals a large number of successful social interactions that they feel are successful on their own terms, and helping them to begin to process and key into that so that we can sort of desensitize the experience of anxiety, the experience of social interaction effectively, so that a social interaction can be less of an anxiety-producing event and instead be something that is non-aversive and ultimately, hopefully, more motivating and effective. And I think as that happens, that can open the door for addressing some of the other mechanisms we've talked about today.
Okay, the next question I've got, there were several questions about age ranges on research about social skills. So obviously as kids get a little older, it's a little bit easier to measure and observe. But can you talk just a little bit about different, has social skills analysis been performed at each of these different cohorts from preschool all the way through higher education and adulthood? Or has there really been just focus on the key area, from maybe tweens through teens, or what's the state of the research for that?
Yeah, I mean, at least, in my lab, we focus mostly on teenagers, but actually that's because it's a relatively understudied area. There's maybe a half dozen or a dozen of us nationally who labs that kind of focus particularly mostly on adolescents. A lot of the study of social functioning really is more, lives more historically in elementary school or even preschool. That's where the study of this kind of all comes from, even in typically developing kids. I should say many of the data, much of the data I presented for you here goes down to as young as 4, and then as you saw near the end, all the way up through adulthood. So I tried to identify at least some factors, the factors we talked about today, that seem like they have implications that kind of cut across the developmental range. The way things manifest may be different at different ages. For instance, studying that idea of social creativity in a very young child is a little bit trickier. But other ones, like social information processing, speed and efficiency, or knowledge, or contextual variability, or even insight, these are things that have implications kind of across stages of development.
Okay. All right, well, we have time for just one more question. The last question is about, they're asking about shame and self-evaluation, and I think that relates to a lot of things that you talked about, but how when you're helping kids with self-esteem, when people are thinking about this, and I know that I'm bordering over into the therapy side of things, but how does that factor into the data that you collect, like that self-esteem piece, and maybe shame isn't the right word, but how does that look from a researcher's perspective, and is it something that you think can be reshaped?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really powerful question, and one that definitely comes up a lot. The self-esteem piece. So, when I was talking a little bit before about this idea of insight, we're touching a bit on this notion of self-esteem, right? And this notion of, well, how do I reflect on my own social behavior, and then how does that inform what I'm proud of? And I think it's, I sort of want to highlight two things that came up earlier in this talk. The first thing I said at that time, and I really want to reiterate it, is that when we do encounter these kids who have this big discrepancy between how they report themselves to be doing and the way their parents do, that the most important thing to do in that situation, particularly to avoid this sort of sense of shame or sort of undermining their sense of self-esteem, is not to just dive in and say, well, let me tell you all the things that are a challenge for you, but instead to really get to know that child and help them to build up their sense of self-esteem around something that they themselves are good at and can kind of be a more solid foundation for their confidence. I think, in absence of that, we really risk doing a disservice to kids who are often, great at so many things, and instead put them in a position where it's hard to, where we're ultimately communicating a message to them that's not prideful, and they have a lot to be proud of. I've never, ever, 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 of the thousands of kids I've worked with, met a child who did not have something that they could be proud of and that their family could be proud of. And often it spent a lot of years in experiences and interventions that taught them otherwise, or that taught them to just focus on all the things they don't do well. And so I think our responsibility often becomes, how can we undo that? How can we unlearn that? And that gets to sort of that second piece I was just referring to, which is this idea of sort of creating, what I call sort of enriched social environments, sort of opportunities where actually social experiences themselves can be rewarding, can be successful, where kids who have so many years of experience of things not going well can start to see it go well. And if we can do that, and that underlies a lot of the sort of intervention piece I guess I'll talk about next time. If we can do that more effectively, then I think that's essential for building not only social competence, but again, this idea of social confidence. And I've very rarely met anyone where that's impossible. But sometimes there's a lot more of those negative experiences to sort of unlearn. But that becomes our job as researchers and ultimately as clinicians to try to give them enough opportunities to begin to unlearn those negative associations and to build that confidence.